Sir, with respect, this approach is beyond current capability for a pilot who hasn't flown the aircraft type in active service. Lieutenant Brendan Falk said it at the briefing table with the careful precision of a naval aviator delivering a safety assessment he has thought through. He was looking at the weather readout on the projector. 3 miles visibility, 800-foot ceiling, a southeast wind at 12 knots. And then at the 79-year-old man in the tan canvas trousers, who was sitting across the table with a worn leather kneeboard in front of him, and was looking at the approach plate with the specific attention of someone reading it rather than seeing it for the first time. The old man looked up from the plate. He looked at the weather readout. He looked at Falk. "What's your concern specifically?" he said. "The ceiling, the visibility, or the circling approach to 07 left?" Falk paused. "All three. The circling approach in these conditions requires precise aircraft control on instruments, without the benefit of a glass cockpit. The A-4 is a steam gauge aircraft. You'd be flying raw data with no trend indicators, no autopilot coupling, no—" "I know what the A-4 has," Tom said. He said it the way he said everything, precisely, without heat, as a statement of fact. He looked back at the approach plate. "I have 1,200 hours in type. I flew this exact approach in worse conditions than this." He looked up. "In 1968, from a carrier." Falk looked at him. He looked at the kneeboard, the laminated approach plate with its hand-annotated minimums and technique notes in faded pencil, the leather worn soft from decades of cockpit use. He looked at the faded blue windbreaker and the deck shoes. He said, "Sir, I'm sure you were an excellent pilot, but currency matters. The last entry in your logbook for the A-4 was 1982, Tom said. "I know." He produced the kneeboard from the table and held it up, the approach plate face out, the annotations visible. "But the approach hasn't changed. The aircraft hasn't changed. The ceiling and visibility tonight are better than what I had on the 14th of March, 1968, when I flew this approach from a partial panel with the Taycan degraded and the ship pitching in a 3-foot sea." He set the kneeboard down. "The only thing that's changed is that I'm 79 instead of 22. I'd like to demonstrate that the relevant capability is not age." What Lieutenant Falk did not know, and what the museum program's visitor sheet had not specified beyond name, rank, and flight hours, was that Thomas Kessler had been one of the U.S. Navy's most decorated carrier pilots of the Vietnam era, that he had flown 212 combat missions from 3 carriers across 2 deployments, and had been awarded the Navy Cross for an action on the night of March 14, 1968, in which he had successfully completed a night carrier approach in conditions that the ship's air operations officer had described in his log as unsuitable for flight operations. No radar vectors, Takan partially degraded, visibility below minimums, the deck pitching in confused seas, because the alternative was ditching a functioning aircraft, and the war required the aircraft to be functional in the morning. He had landed. The aircraft had been functional in the morning. He had come back from Vietnam in 1969 and had spent the next 13 years in carrier aviation, training, fleet service, and eventually the development of carrier approach technique documentation that had been used as training reference material at Pensacola since 1974. Lieutenant Commander Okafor had found the monograph in the museum's archive. His name was on the cover. She had called the number in the Naval Aviation Alumni Registry. The Living History program had been attempting the circling approach to runway 07L in low visibility conditions for 3 sessions. The approach required the specific instrument scan technique that steam gauge pilots developed over years of flying raw data. The compressed instrument scan, the cross-check rhythm, The visual transition that happened in the last 200 feet, with no electronic guidance. Modern pilots trained on glass did not learn it the same way, because they did not need it the same way. Tom had learned it when there was no other way. He had arrived that morning with his kneeboard and his watch, and nothing to prove. He had a great deal to show. If you believe that 1,200 hours in type and the specific education that comes from landing on a carrier at night in weather that should have killed you produces a capability that does not expire at 79, type carrier in the comments right now. Because what happens when Tom Kessler straps into the A-4 Skyhawk and flies the approach that 3 previous attempts could not complete is something that Lieutenant Falk described in his debrief as the most instructive 40 minutes of his aviation career. His full name was Thomas Arthur Kessler. He had been born in Escambia County, Florida, in the fall of 1946, 3 miles from Naval Air Station Pensacola, the home of naval aviation. The son of a former Navy enlisted man and a woman who had watched aircraft fly over her house for her entire adult life and considered them as natural a feature of the Florida sky as clouds. Tom had not been predestined to fly. He had been predestined to be near flying for so long that eventually the distinction between watching aircraft and being in one had disappeared. He had received his commission through the Naval ROTC program at the University of Florida in 1968 and had completed primary flight training at Pensacola. The same runways, the same approaches, the same Gulf of Mexico to the south. In the winter of 1968. He had been designated a naval aviator in March of that year and had reported to his 1st Fleet Squadron, VF-24, 3 months before his first deployment aboard the USS Coral Sea to the Western Pacific. His first combat deployment had been 9 months long and had produced the specific education that only sustained carrier operations in a combat environment provides. The education of performing precise instrument, flying in degraded conditions, in tired states, in aircraft that were not always functioning to specification, on moving decks in seas that were not always calm, repeatedly, without the luxury of declining. He had learned the compressed instrument scan not from a simulator, but from the requirement to fly it in conditions where the alternative to flying it correctly was the ocean. The action on March 14, 1968, had been the culmination of that education. The night had been bad, low overcast, visibility below published minimums, a sea state that put the deck in motion beyond the preferred envelope. The ship's air operations officer had broadcast a weather advisory that amounted to a recommendation not to attempt approaches. Tom had been in the pattern with insufficient fuel to divert. He had flown the approach. He had landed. The Navy Cross citation described the action in the language of official recognition. What it did not describe was the instrument scan, the cross-check rhythm, the visual transition in the last 200 feet, the specific acquired capability of a man who had been flying in bad weather since his first solo and had never had the option of waiting for it to improve. He had come home from the second deployment in 1970, completed his Navy career in various training and fleet roles, and retired as a commander in 1990. He had maintained a current pilot's certificate through General Aviation. He flew a Cessna 172 out of a small airport in Escambia County every week, had done so for 34 years, and had never had a certificate violation, an accident, or an incident that required a report. He had 1,200 hours in the A-4 Skyhawk. His last flight in one had been in 1982. The aircraft in the museum hangar was the same model, the same steam gauge cockpit, the same compressed instrument scan. 43 years was a long time. The scan was the same. He had told Okafor when she called, that he would come and look at the approach and tell her whether he thought he could fly it. He had looked at the weather and the approach plate and the aircraft. He had told her yes, he would need a current checkout in the aircraft, standard, appropriate, non-negotiable, and he would need 45 minutes to reacquaint himself with the cockpit. After that, the ceiling and visibility the morning was offering were better than the 14th of March, 1968. He was ready. Falk had not been immediately persuaded. He had said, with the professional care of a safety-conscious naval aviator, "I understand your background, Commander. I still have a responsibility to assess current capability rather than historical performance." Tom had looked at him. "That's correct," he said. "And I'm telling you the current capability is there. The instrument scan doesn't expire. The visual transition technique doesn't expire. What expires is currency, which affects the execution speed and the confidence margin. Currency can be restored with a checkout flight, which I've asked for." He looked at Okafor. "One checkout flight in the aircraft, then the approach in these conditions." Okafor nodded. Falk looked at the weather readout. He looked at the kneeboard. He looked at the old man in the deck shoes. He said, "One checkout. If Chief Mendez clears you current after the checkout, I'll sign the weather release." Tom looked at Chief Mendez, who had been standing at the back wall of the briefing room since the exchange began, and who was holding something, had been holding it since approximately the moment Tom produced the kneeboard. Mendez was a 52-year-old career aviation instructor who had been at Pensacola for 11 years and who knew the museum's historical collection well enough to have recognized, when Tom put the kneeboard on the table, that the approach plate annotation style matched something he had seen in a document in the museum's archive. He was holding that document. He walked to the table. He set it down. It was the 1974 monograph, Carrier Approach Technique in Low Visibility Conditions. A Practical Guide for Steam Gauge Operations, authored by Lieutenant Commander T.A. Kessler, VF-24, published through the Naval Aviation School's command at Pensacola. 43 pages. The foundational reference document for instrument approach technique in the museum's Living History Flight Program. The document that Okafor had found in the archive. The document that Falk had read during his orientation to the program 6 months earlier. The kneeboard annotation style was the same because it was the same person. Falk read the cover. He read it again. He looked at the old man in the deck shoes. He said quietly, "You wrote the technique guide." "In 1974, Tom said, "based on what I learned between 1968 and 1971. He looked at the monograph. The circling approach section is pages 31 through 37. The visual transition technique I use starts on page 34. He picked up the monograph. He handed it back to Mendez. "It hasn't changed. The physics haven't changed. Subscribe to Iron and Honor right now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because when Tom Kessler straps into Bureau number 149956, completes a 40-minute checkout, and then flies the circling approach to runway 07, left in 3-mile visibility with an 800-foot ceiling that 3 previous attempts could not complete. The radio call he makes on final, 4 words, is the only thing he says between the outer marker and the runway threshold. The checkout took 35 minutes. Mendez rode in the back seat. When they landed, Mendez climbed out and told Falk 2 things. The old man's instrument scan was the fastest and most precise he had seen in 11 years at Pensacola, and the checkout was complete. Falk signed the weather release. Tom strapped in alone for the approach flight. He ran the checklist from memory, the same checklist in the same sequence, that he had run 1,200 times across 22 years. He taxied to the runway without the kneeboard on his leg, because he did not need the approach plate to fly. An approach he had flown hundreds of times. The kneeboard was in the cockpit with him in the seat pocket in case he wanted it. He did not open it. He flew the departure, the hold, and the full procedure turn. He flew the final approach course inbound. At the outer marker, he made his radio call. 4 words, Skyhawk final, 07 left, and began the instrument scan that he had been running since 1968. The compressed cross-check rhythm that moved between altimeter, airspeed, heading, and rate of descent in the sequence that the 1974 monograph described on page 34. At 200 feet above the decision height, he acquired the runway visually. The transition was immediate and smooth. The specific rapid mental shift from instruments to outside that steam gauge pilots learn over thousands of hours, and that glass pilots learn differently, if at all. He landed. He rolled out. He taxied clear. Falk was watching from the tower. He had been watching the approach on radar and on the visual feed from the approach end camera. He had watched a 79-year-old man in a museum aircraft fly an instrument approach in conditions that 3 previous attempts had turned back from and land with the precision of a carrier-qualified aviator who had never stopped being one. He keyed his radio. "Nice approach," he said. "Wind's calm, runway clear." Tom taxied to the ramp. He shut down. He climbed out with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has climbed out of cockpits 10,000 times and found the same ground waiting. He was carrying the kneeboard. He had not opened it. He walked to the briefing room where Okafor and Falk and Mendez were standing. He set the kneeboard on the table. Falk was looking at him with the expression of a man who has revised his understanding of something he thought he understood. He said, "The visual transition, at 200 feet above minimums. How fast is that transition?" Tom thought about it. "Immediate," he said. "When you have the runway, you have it. There is no gradual. You're on instruments, and then you're outside, and the instruments are confirmation, not primary. If the transition takes more than a second, you haven't acquired the runway. You've acquired something that looks like the runway." He looked at Falk. "That distinction is what the checkout teaches. That's why you can't simulate it in a glass cockpit. The glass tells you where you are. Steam gauges teach you to know where you are." Falk wrote this down. He had been writing since Tom started talking. He had been writing the way Torres had written in the infantry classroom. The way young people write when an old person is saying something that matters. "The 1968 approach," he said. "March 14th. Below minimums, no radar vectors, degraded to con, moving deck. Were you scared?" Tom looked at him for a moment. "I was focused," he said. "There's not much room for scared when you're on the scan. The scan takes everything." He picked up the kneeboard. He put it in his jacket pocket. "I was scared after, on the deck, when the aircraft stopped and I had a moment to think about what I'd just done." He looked at Falk. "That's how you know you're human. The scared comes after. During, you just fly." He shook Falk's hand. He shook Okafor's hand. He thanked Mendez for the checkout. He walked to his car in the museum parking lot, the kneeboard in his jacket pocket, the same way it had been in his jacket pocket since 1969. He drove home to Escambia County, 3 miles from NAS Pensacola, where the aircraft still flew overhead the same way they had flown overhead when his mother was watching them and he was too young to understand why they mattered. He understood now. He had understood since March 14th, 1968. He wrote the approach in his logbook that evening, Standard format: date, aircraft type, conditions, approach type, outcome. He wrote one word in the remarks column: current. There are men in this country who have 1,200 hours in an aircraft type and who flew an approach in worse conditions than the one the modern pilots called impossible in 1968, at night, from a carrier, with no radar vectors and a degraded navigation system and a deck that was moving beneath them. The capability doesn't expire. The scan doesn't expire. What they learned in the cockpit over 22 years and 2 combat deployments is not a memory. It is a physical vocabulary that lives in the hands and the eyes and the specific rhythm of a crosscheck that never fully stops running. Tom Kessler flew home from the approach to runway 7 left and wrote one word in his logbook: current. Because that is what he was. Not historically, not formerly, not in the context of what he used to be. Currently. The word means now. Subscribe to Iron and Honor for the men who are still current in the things that matter. Hit the bell, don't miss the next one. The approach was impossible. He had flown it blind in 1968. He flew it again in 2025 and wrote one word in his logbook. The word was current. That was the whole answer.